Alexander Spesivtsev was born on March 1st, 1970, in Novokuznetsk, Russia. He became the second child in the family after his older sister Nadezhda. Their father, Nikolai, loved alcohol and beautiful women and didn't hide his affairs from his wife, Ludmila. She endured it for years and decided to file for divorce only when Alexander turned 15. By that time, the perpetually drunk head of the family had already made life miserable for his loved ones. Ludmila always rushed to protect her children, especially her son. Alexander's mother always felt a special love and pity for him. Although he was born full-term, he was underweight and later grew up as a sickly child. Her overprotectiveness went so far that he didn't have his own bed until the age of 12 and slept with his mother until then. Alexander was a withdrawn child, quarrelsome by nature, and prone to mischief. The people who suffered most from the schoolboy's behavior were the neighbors in the apartment building on Pioneersky Avenue. At some point, Spesivtsev made Adolf Hitler his idol, and soon the walls of the building were covered with swastikas and praises to the fascist dictator. Matches jammed into locks, broken mailboxes, burned-out doorbells, and elevator buttons. All of that was Alexander's doing. He even entered elevators solely to vandalize them. For some strange reason, every member of the Spesivtsev family, including Alexander himself, would only go up to their 9th-floor apartment, number 357, using the stairs. At first, other residents of the building tried to complain to Ludmila about her son, but she fiercely rejected any accusations and eventually started spitting in the faces of anyone who spoke ill of him. As a result, the neighbors began avoiding the strange family altogether. Meanwhile, Spesivtsev started stealing newspapers and magazines from the mailboxes he himself had damaged, and soon he was stealing bicycles left in the stairwell. Before long, Alexander was caught. He broke into a school classroom using a lockpick and stole radio parts. After that, the authorities tried to send him to a Kemerovo reform school for juvenile offenders. But once again, his mother came to his defense. She managed to persuade the school administration to give her son another chance, and Alexander was allowed to stay. Incidentally, Ludmila Spesivtseva herself was also involved in theft. She was fired from her position as a school supply manager in one of Novokuznetsk's schools after a major shortage of soap, light bulbs, and brooms was discovered. Her next job was at a courthouse, where she became an assistant to a blind lawyer. Her daughter Nadezhda helped her, working there as a clerk. Now Ludmila often brought home volumes of criminal case files filled with photos of mutilated victims. The content of those folders fascinated Alexander, and the Spesivtsev family spent many evenings studying the gruesome details of the murders. This captivated the young man far more than his studies, which he barely completed. After finishing school, he didn't go anywhere else to study. At first, Spesivtsev worked repairing small household appliances, and in 1988, he was preparing to join the army. However, that never happened. During the medical examination, it was revealed that the conscript had serious psychological problems, so instead of being sent to a military unit, he was committed to a psychiatric hospital in Novokuznetsk. After a short period of treatment, he was released and returned home. In 1991, the 21-year-old Spesivtsev met 17-year-old Evgenia Guzilnikova, and they began a romantic relationship. Alexander was even introduced to her family as her future fiancé. However, the wedding never took place. At some point, Spesivtsev started picking on the girl over trivial matters, and it all ended when he beat her so badly that she was hospitalized with a head injury. After beating the girl, Spesivtsev didn't stop there. He went to her hospital room and attacked her again. She was saved only by the timely intervention of nurses. After that, Evgenia decided to cut off all contact with Alexander and start a new life. But he had other plans. Spesivtsev lured the girl to his apartment under false pretenses and never let her leave. By that time, his mother and sister had moved to another apartment, supposedly to give the young couple space to build their life together. Spesivtsev tortured his victim for a long time. He starved her, beat her, cut her with a knife, and burned her with a lighter, drowning out her screams with loud music. The neighbors, long accustomed to the noise from apartment 357, paid no attention, and the girl's parents didn't realize she was missing right away. They thought the girl was simply spending time with her future husband. The police were only contacted a month after Evgenia's disappearance. Soon, investigators went to Spesivtsev's apartment and broke down the door. The girl was dead. Her mutilated body, covered in wounds, had been placed on the bed by Spesivtsev, who slept next to it. Forensic experts determined that the girl had died from sepsis. Meanwhile, Spesivtsev, declared mentally competent, categorically denied torturing or starving his fiancée. On the contrary, he claimed he had taken devoted care of Evgenia, who was ill and refused to eat. His mother, Ludmila, supported her son's version. She was so outraged by the accusations that she even threw stones at one of the local prosecutor's office windows. Soon after, Alexander was once again sent for compulsory psychiatric treatment, this time to a specialized hospital in the Oriol region. Shortly before that, while awaiting trial in custody, the maniac tattooed a letter on his arm in memory of his tortured lover. Yet Spesivtsev didn't lose hope of arranging his personal life. While in the hospital, he had a small metal ball implanted under the skin of his genitals. Instead of pleasure, this intimate piercing brought him severe infection and intense groin pain. After 3 years of treatment, he was released from the psychiatric hospital, declared no longer dangerous to society, though he still suffered from severe inflammation. Spesivtsev moved in with his mother and sister, but showed no interest in reintegrating into normal life. Instead of finding a job, he spent his days hanging around the Novokuznetsk train station, where he often joined groups of homeless people. The vagrants welcomed him. He always brought a bottle of cheap port wine, and after drinking, they would sit around pitying him. But this pastime soon bored Spesivtsev. In late February 1996, he met a 20-year-old woman named Elena Trunova, who worked as a kindergarten assistant. She agreed to visit him at his apartment. According to Spesivtsev's later testimony, he told Trunova about his problems caused by his piercing, and she allegedly laughed. An argument broke out, and at some point Elena insulted him, which made him snap. You fall asleep in pain and wake up in pain, and then someone looks you in the eyes and reminds you about your sickness, he said later. I just hate it. I just hate such people. After tormenting his victim, the maniac killed and dismembered Trunova, then ordered his mother to dispose of the remains, which she obediently carried out, burying them in a deserted field under the cover of night. A month later, Ludmila Spesivtseva once again went to that same field, carrying buckets containing the remains of another young woman. The third victim her son had lured to his apartment. In April 1996, Spesivtsev noticed a group of teenagers loitering near a construction site of a local department store. He approached them, offered them cigarettes, and then suggested they join him in robbing an apartment. The teenagers thought he was inviting them on an exciting adventure and followed their new acquaintance. Spesivtsev brought the group to his apartment, locked the door, and ordered them into the bedroom. As soon as they entered, he pulled out a knife and killed them one by one. He then piled their bodies in a corner, covered them with a cloth, and waited for his mother to arrive. At that time, Ludmila was working as a night watchwoman at a kindergarten and lived with her daughter in another apartment. She only visited her son a week after the massacre, and in the hallway, she came upon 6 decomposing corpses, which she now had to dispose of. Later, Spesivtsev claimed he didn't know what his mother did with the bodies, but by the next morning, there was no trace of the slaughter in the apartment. It is believed that Ludmila dismembered the bodies and dumped the remains into the ABA River, which flowed not far from their building. In May 1996, Spesivtsev returned to the same construction site and met 4 teenage girls. He lured them to his apartment by offering them work selling soap. Once again, it was his mother who got rid of the murdered girls' remains. By that time, the Spesivtsev family had begun feeding parts of the victims' bodies to their pet, a huge Newfoundland dog. Whether they themselves ever ate human flesh is unknown. The family categorically denied any acts of cannibalism. Meanwhile, Spesivtsev continued killing. In May 1996 alone, In addition to the 4 schoolgirls, at least 7 more people died in his evil apartment. Despite his disturbing appearance, the maniac knew how to win the trust of teenagers who, forgetting all caution, followed him into his lair. In some cases, it was Ludmila Spesivtseva who lured the victims. Siblings, in particular, were easy to deceive. They felt safe together. Among the victims were 11-year-old Olga and 9-year-old Alexander Spesivtsev. And a few days later, 13-year-old Irina and 12-year-old Dmitry Vorobyov. The constant disappearances of children and young women in Novokuznetsk could not go unnoticed. Relatives of the missing filed reports with the authorities, but investigators were initially unable to find any leads. They explored several theories, one being that the missing might have been kidnapped and taken into slavery in Chechnya. As a result, members of all Caucasian organized crime groups in Novokuznetsk were investigated, but the gangsters vehemently denied any involvement, and the police had no solid evidence. Other theories emerged as well. For instance, that the missing individuals had fallen victim to black market organ traffickers. Then, in June 1996, horrific news shook the entire city. Along the banks of the Aba River, human body parts began to appear: decomposed heads, arms, legs, and torsos, most of them belonging to children. Examining the remains, experts determined that the bodies had been dismembered using saws and scissors. There was no longer any doubt among law enforcement. A serial killer was operating in Novokuznetsk. Additional forces were sent to the city, including experienced detectives and investigators. The military joined in as well, combing through forests, attics, and basements, and patrolling empty lots. At one point, suspicion briefly fell on another killer, the Tolyatti Ripper, Oleg Rilkov, who was active around the same time. But after his arrest, it was confirmed that he had never left Tolyatti. Amazingly, the investigators could have caught Spesivtsev much sooner. They began checking all mentally ill individuals registered with local psychiatric services. The review was completed quickly, but Spesivtsev's name was not on any list. His discharge from the Oriol Psychiatric Hospital had never been properly documented. As a result, no one, neither the local clinic nor the police, knew that he had returned to Novokuznetsk. Otherwise, because of Spesivtsev's declared recovery, investigators should have reopened his criminal case for the murder of Evgenia. As a result, the fatal negligence of doctors led to many more deaths. The police also made serious mistakes. One of the Spesivtsev's neighbors had complained about the smell of decomposition in the stairwell and the constant loud music coming from Alexander's apartment. However, her complaints were ignored, and no one ever came to check on the maniac. Despite the fact that Novokuznetsk was practically flooded with police at the time, the Spesivtsevs continued luring victims into their lair. From June to the end of August 1996, the maniac murdered 4 schoolgirls, 2 women, and 1 35-year-old man. But his most horrifying crime was committed against 3 friends: Anastasia Bruneva, her peer Evgenia Bereshkina, and 15-year-old Olga Galtseva. The girls met while undergoing medical examinations in a hospital and often went for walks together. On September 24th, they went out for a walk as usual and stopped by a grocery store to buy water. As they were leaving, they encountered a small gray-haired elderly woman who complained that she couldn't open the door to her apartment and asked the girls for help, promising to reward them with disposable cups for water. The girls agreed and followed the stranger. It was Ludmila Spesivtseva. The old woman led them to her apartment and rang the doorbell. It was opened by a nearly unrecognizable Alexander Spesivtsev, with his massive dog standing beside him. The terrified girls obeyed his order and entered the apartment. Spesivtsev introduced himself as Andrei and drove them into the bedroom, telling them to wait. The girls pleaded for him to let them go. Evgenia began crying loudly, so Spesivtsev decided to inject her with a sedative. At that moment, Anastasia seized the chance. She crept up behind him and tried to hit him over the head with a bottle, but missed and struck his shoulder instead. Enraged, Spesivtsev lunged at her. "I stabbed her several times," he later said. in the heart, a little lower, around the stomach, and in the throat. She was still alive, so I strangled her with a rope. After killing Anastasia, he forced her friends to cut her body into pieces and remove flesh from the bones to make soup, which he then made Olga and Evgenia eat. He threw part of the skeleton to his dog. As usual, Lyudmila later carried the remains out of the apartment. At that time, Spesivtsev's sister, Nadezhda, was in the apartment with him and the victims, but did nothing to help the girls. Alexander continued torturing them day after day. He was especially cruel to Evgenia. He raped her, burned her with a soldering iron, broke her arms, and repeatedly smashed her head. He stitched her wounds with an ordinary needle and thread. Once, Spesivtsev flew into a rage and beat Bereshkina's head against the floor until she stopped moving. Her friend Olga tried to save her, performing artificial respiration for nearly an hour, but Evgenia's injuries were too severe. She died. Olga later told investigators that Spesivtsev left her friend's body untouched for 3 days, claiming it was part of his twisted religious beliefs. He wanted to let her soul leave the body, and so he kept a window open. When 3 days had passed, he ordered Olga to dismember her friend's body. He planned to bury all the remains together, but he never got the chance. On October 24th, 1996, the police finally came for him. A few days earlier, one of the neighbors had complained about problems with her heating. When maintenance workers came to check the pipes, they began inspecting each apartment. Eventually, they reached the Spesivtsev's 9th-floor apartment, but Alexander refused to let them in. He told them he was mentally ill and locked up by his mother. He repeated this same story to the local police officer who came for inspection. As a result, a full police unit arrived and broke down the door. What they saw inside was horrifying, a stench of death and complete chaos. The maniac kept 82 pieces of clothing belonging to his victims, including children's shoes. From the bodies, he had taken about 40 pieces of jewelry, rings, earrings, chains, all neatly stored in a separate box. Before killing his victims, Spesivtsev often photographed them with an old Polaroid camera. The officers found Olga Galtseva, still barely alive, lying on the floor of one of the rooms. She had been stabbed several times in the abdomen with an awl. The girl was terrified, expecting the maniac to burst in and finish her off. He had promised to kill her if the police ever came. She was taken to the hospital and managed to give testimony, but despite doctors' efforts, she died 3 days later from peritonitis and pulmonary edema. Meanwhile, the maniac himself wasn't at home when the police arrived. He escaped through the fire escape to the roof of the building and hid there. Once the police left his apartment, he fled. A few days later, Spesivtsev returned to the entrance of his building, where he was arrested by an officer on duty. "I had no choice," he said later. "They refused me treatment, and I have a weak immune system. In summer, I wear a jacket and sweater. Look, my hands are covered in sores." That's how he tried to justify his urge to kill. Soon, the police also arrested Lyudmila. The maniac didn't hide the fact that his mother had been his active accomplice. However, during confrontations, she denied most of the crimes and claimed her son was lying. During the investigation, Spesivtsev confessed to 19 murders committed between February and September of 1996. Some reports suggest he may have had as many as 82 victims, based on the amount of clothing found in his apartment. Initially, investigators managed to prove his involvement only in the murders of Berniva, Bereshkina, and Galtseva, as well as his first known victim, Elena Chernova. Psychiatrists in Novokuznetsk declared Alexander sane. He was sentenced to death, and even offered to sell his head after execution for medical research, in exchange for a few packs of cigarettes. However, in 1997, the maniac was given only 10 years in prison, an inexplicably lenient punishment considering the scale of his crimes. A year later, a new trial began after investigators gathered evidence for 15 more murders committed by Spesivtsev. It seemed that the death penalty was inevitable. But before the new trial could begin, he had to undergo another psychiatric examination, this time at the Serbsky Institute in Moscow. After several months of observation, The specialist concluded that he was mentally ill and insisted on his transfer to a psychiatric hospital. Alexander Spesivtsev was committed to a special psychiatric facility in Kamyshin, Volgograd region, where he remains to this day. He doesn't complain about his living conditions and eats well. Even his fingernails and toenails are trimmed for him by orderlies. The maniac has been officially recognized as a Group 2 invalid and receives a small monthly pension of several thousand rubles. Spesivtsev sends part of his pension to his mother and spends the rest on chocolate or saves it to buy a stereo system. In his free time, he reads books, writes poetry, and does crafts, making collages and drawings, some of which he sends to his mother. Lyudmila Spesivtseva was sentenced to 13 years in prison and was released from the Mariinsk Women's Colony in 2009. After her release, she and her daughter Nadezhda left Novokuznetsk. In 2013, the two women attempted to return to their old apartment on Pioneersky Avenue, but were met with fierce resistance from the building's residents. Eventually, Lyudmila and Nadezhda managed to enter their home only under police escort, who helped them bring in their belongings. However, they didn't stay long and soon disappeared without a trace. Their apartment remains empty to this day. No one wants to buy or rent a place with such a horrifying history. According to some reports, the two women settled in the town of Osiniki in the Kemerovo region. When locals found out, they began contacting the Osiniki city administration, demanding that the cannibal women be expelled. By mistake, they even harassed an elderly woman who merely resembled Lyudmila. She was bombarded with curses and threats. To protect herself, she had to constantly show her passport to prove her identity. As for Lyudmila Spesivtseva, who turned 80 years old in 2019, she continues to send petitions to various authorities. She still hopes that her son will one day be released and that the family will be reunited. However, that day will almost certainly never come. Even if specialists were to declare Alexander Spesivtsev mentally healthy and release him from the psychiatric hospital, he would not walk free. He would immediately be sent to serve a prison sentence, almost certainly for life.